What if the majority of us, where it was normal to be educated to fall in love with the process, right? To fall in love with being able to ask better, new, and different sorts of questions. That is the fundamental scaffolding of building creativity as a competency.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Keynote Curators Podcast. I'm Seth Deckman, your Keynote Curator. Today, we're going to be talking about creativity, innovation, and the future of work with our guest, Natalie Nixon. Natalie, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Seth. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
It's equally great to have you here, and we are really, really pleased. We also want to share with our subscribers and our viewers, thank you for returning and joining us today. We're excited that you're here. If you enjoy conversations like this, please subscribe, please share, please comment. It helps us bring you more great speakers and content like our guest today, Natalie Nixon. So Natalie, let's kick off with a conversation about creativity in business. So many leaders say they value that idea, but very few, if any, really know how to cultivate it. In your work with top organizations, what's the biggest misconception about creativity in leadership in the business environment?
Some of the biggest misconceptions about creativity and leadership in the business environment is that creativity is a nice to have. And that's primarily because not everybody, but a lot of people don't actually understand what creativity is. They conflate creativity for art. And art and creativity are very different things. So artists are exceptional at wrestling with the ambiguity of the creative process. But it's my perspective that to be human is to be hardwired to be creative. And the reason, the business case for creativity is that if businesses want to be able to consistently and sustainably innovate, they actually have to build the capacity for creativity in their organizations. And they need to make sure that they are hiring and retaining individuals and leaders who are building creativity as a competency, as something that they can exercise and build up and get better at, to the end of being able to consistently and sustainably innovate. So the biggest misconception is that creativity is a nice to have. We'll get to that woo-woo stuff later after we finish dealing with the important things such as operations and financials and marketing models, which are really significant. However, you actually will not move the needle in your operations or your financial models or your marketing strategy if you do not have this creative capacity, which from my perspective is just essential.
There's a lot there. In my mind, I'm kind of grinning and grimacing a little bit at the same time, because for those that say it's a nice to have, these are my words, not yours. Let's get the Excel spreadsheets and the strategy and all these plans to execute, implemented and deployed. And then, it's nice to have, we can do it. But all that stuff implicitly requires creativity.
Right.
And it feels like what you're saying, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but talk a little bit about how, I feel that people are either asleep or unaware, or it's just hidden from their view on their own creativity.
Absolutely.
And talk a little bit about that.
Well, I have to go back to the way the majority of us have been educated. Most of us have been educated in ways to err on the side of what's the answer? Fill in the dot. I need the answer yesterday, versus falling in love with the process. Mm-hmm. And the process is messy. The process is ambiguous. The process is actually where all the juicy bits are, and that's where all the discovery is. And once we graduate from high school or college or whatever we go on to do, we learn really quickly that it's super ambiguous when we're trying to problem solve in real time and not just meet clients' expectations, but exceed their expectations and delight them in ways that our products or services or experiences are going to meet their needs, not just on a functional level, but on a social and on an emotional level. So I know from personal experience that education we really have to drill down there when we think about how to normalize creativity and embracing creativity as being core to who you or any listener is. I went to three very different sorts of schools by the time I graduated from high school. I'm from Philly. Go Birds! If this is
Go
still
Eagles.
if the
Congratulations on the
Super Bowl
Super
love
Bowl.
is still high, but the first type of school, actually four different types of schools. The first school was a really crunchy granola, hippie, Unitarian, cooperative nursery school, super cool. And then I went to urban public, Philly public schools, which my parents quickly realized that my mom was having to drill my multiplication tables. I was getting an attitude because my friends didn't have to do that after school. She
Right.
was like, something's got to change. My dad then figured out we could go to suburban public school at a neighboring county, but that had a host of other issues, social issues. My sister and I were the first Black children in each of our classes. And while the academics were super great, that was really hard to balance. And then for seventh through 12th grade, I went to a stellar, incredible private Quaker prep school, earned a scholarship to go there. But by ninth grade, they said our dad was making too much money. So kind of the financial aid rolled back. All that to say, education was always the sacrifice for my parents and for my family. And it was essential, it was an essential value to my parents. But what I learned at that final school, the Quaker prep school, it was this totally different culture of learning. I had gotten so good at filling out the worksheets and getting the gold star and giving the teacher what he or she wanted.
Getting the answer.
Getting the answer to all of a sudden being in a learning environment where what was valued was ask a better question. What was valued
Yeah.
was ask forgiveness, not permission. And it was a ninja trick on my brain. My grades plummeted for seventh and eighth grade. And so, I mean, I had to deal with like a campus environment. You change classrooms. I had to play strange sports with sticks, like field hockey and lacrosse,
Right.
like different world. I adapted, but I remember by ninth grade, remember my friends from back on the block or friends I had who were at public schools. Wow, now I'm in an environment where we're basically getting trained to think of the questions. And I used to be in environments where I was just getting trained to stay in your lane
Yeah.
and give us the
Yeah.
right answer. So, what if the majority of us, where it was normal to be educated to fall in love with the process, right? To fall in love with being able to ask better, new, and different sorts of questions. That is the fundamental scaffolding of building creativity as a competency. And it takes exercise, it takes practice. So it's no fault of anybody who's out there is listening who says, well, I kind of like Excel sheets. I like certainty. I like kind of knowing what the answer is.
Yeah.
That's fine. But in some of my keynotes, I have this slide where I remind people, only half jokingly, plans are fiction. Whether the plan is your budget or my daily morning to-do list or the Excel sheet, the reason why plans are fiction is because it hasn't happened yet. So what's more important, it's not that you throw away the plan, but you need to approach it in a much more adaptive way.
Sounds like a title to another book of yours down the road. Plans are fiction. I
Oh, I
mean,
like that.
that is just that embodies just life, because you have the concept, academic, plan, strategy, and then you have kind of what goes on the court I mean, take football, you draw up a play, great, but then the ball is snapped or there's a tip off or it's inbounded and, all bets are off. You kind of got to have that agility and alacrity and flexibility. We had a guest on our podcast recently, Freestyle Plus, Freestyle Love Supreme, where they're come from the world of improv, and they had a residence in Las Vegas, and we did a game called No Right Answers. And it almost sounds like that transition for you to the prep school where, it was like, okay, how do you make a cake? Well, you get a pair of rubber rain boots, you go out and you get a 2x4 where you're going to frame up your window, and then you unplug your computer. And they're like, yay, you have to pick three things that are wrong,
Oh,
but
I love that game. That's awesome.
But the point is, it sounds to me like, part of your journey and the work that you're doing, not just in your keynotes and your books, but, all the work you've done. I know you've worked in the retail world and you've journeyed in Europe and South America and done consulting and all sorts of really cool and creative things, is that, how do we get unconstrained? And how do we lose that one-dimensional, safe, comfortable, familiar, predictable? It's a risk taking. You need an entrepreneurial spirit. You need to reallocate this the resources of certainty and surrender and let go. There's a lot of psychology to it, you
There
know?
is.
Yeah.
Well, I'll answer your question. How do we let go? How do we get comfortable with kind of looser constraints and being wrong
Well,
sometimes?
see, pardon me, that's creativity right there because you did the work for me. I'm not even sure I asked the question, but you found a question. You found a question for me. So maybe you're both the host and the guest. So thank
We're
you.
having a conversation. It's fine. Um, I'll answer the question from the perspective of what individuals can do and then what people can do in their organizations. One of the best ways to get more comfortable with uncertainty is to become a clumsy student of something. I don't
Mm,
care what it is, but something where you are not the smartest person in the room, where you really are bad at the XYZ thing. Like for example, I keep saying this, I'm going to commit to this in 2025. I want to learn how to play poker because I have a horrible poker face. And I suspect that maybe it will help me to get better at having a poker face. But I'm going to start probably with bridge because there's this community we belong to where you're going to be starting bridge lessons. I'm going to try, right? Because I'm really bad at cards and I don't think that quickly on the fly, but I'm going to try it, right? But something I've been a really clumsy student of for the past 5 years consistently is ballroom dance. Now, in all transparency, I've studied dance since I was 4 years old. I studied modern dance. I danced in the company in college. But when you don't go on to become a professional dancer and you still want to dance, the options are really limited. You have like dancers classes with professional dancers who need to audition tomorrow or 13-year-olds. And it's really hard to find something in between. And I would dip in and out of different sorts of classes and landed on ballroom, which is a whole nother story, actually 17 years ago is when I first started to tiptoe in the ballroom. But what that does is it rewires the neural synapses in my brain, in your brain, when you don't know the answer, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. You need to get over yourself really quickly and get better at
yeah.
asking a
Yeah.
question, clarification,
Yeah.
observing others around you. How do they do XYZ? Following your intuition. What I'm kind of mapping out here is Seth, you know my work, and I'm a frameworks nerd. I love dreaming up frameworks. And so, in addition to this framework of wonder and rigor, how I think about creativity, yes, I also think about the three I's. So, when you're a clumsy student of something, you're practicing the three I's of inquiry, being more improvisational, being more intuitive. So, that's what you can do in your personal life. And what it's going to do is help the rewiring of your neural synapses so that when you show up to a problem solving situation on the job, you're not as shy about asking a question. You're not as reticent to follow your intuition. You're a lot more open to being experimental and improvisational. Now, what you can do on the job is you can redesign meetings. Meetings are the biggest artifacts of organizational cultures, and you can tell so much about
Mm,
a
yeah.
company, an association, a team by the way they hold meetings. So there's all sorts of ways you can redesign meetings, but I'll give one small example. You can start each meeting with something called question storming. So we've all heard of brainstorming.
Sure.
Rather than the goal to be to list as many answers as possible, the goal is to list as many questions as possible at the top of a meeting, given a prompt, right? Maybe the prompt is we're calling this meeting today to think about how we can revisit a former competitor and maybe think about co-opetition, like joining forces with them. So instead of like thinking of all sorts of answers to that, literally can just take 90 seconds. It just doesn't have to be 15 minutes of the entire meeting. 90 seconds, quietly allow each person to generate a series of questions around this competitor. Why questions, what if questions, I wonder questions are awesome. Those are called divergent questions. But also if you want, it can be who, what, when, where sorts of
Sure.
convergent questions. But what that does is even if you start to do this every other meeting, it normalizes curiosity. We've all heard our teachers say there's no bad questions, but there literally are no bad questions. And there's going to be someone on your team who poses a question that's going to open up a whole new pathway for discovery and inquiry about that challenge.
Again, to our subscribers and our viewers, just this is such great stuff. So, and I know this is why you all come here. So continue to share and like and comment and subscribe. It's just really great stuff. Natalie, it seems like putting that in or placing that practice in, you've heard the term facilitative question, but it does just facilitate in a bigger picture, that curiosity, provoking a dialogue, provoking people coming out of their silos, to use the jargon, if you will. But the meeting as an artifact, and the archaeologist in all of us, it is an interesting way to look at layers of an organization and how they operate. And
yes,
I never kind of looked at it that way. I do want to bring it back to Philly for a moment in the sports analogy, because you said something earlier that struck my mind, and it's about solving problems. And, the late, great Kobe Bryant from Philadelphia was asked, about his plans on the court. And he kind of said in Kobe style, plans? I just solve problems. And it's like, dude, seriously? Like, because he was famous for 3-4 o'clock in the morning, waking up, doing a 3-hour workout, and then getting to the practice facility at 7 a.m., and just the work, the basics of having that all there so that you can leave the constraint of structure, the predictability, the box that we're going to get the answer, capital T, capital A, and have that freedom that your foundation is there. Here's my observation / question. I really want to dial in with this for you and for our viewers and our subscribers. I read your book, The Creativity Leap.
Thank you.
And here's Creativity Leap. We're going to put it in the show notes for our listeners and our subscribers. I don't care, Natalie, if you're a bond lawyer, if you're working HVAC, if you're the director of a tennis school, it requires creativity to do what you do.
Yes.
And I think the more that you're in touch with it, the more that you're aware with it, the more you can own it, if you will, or dominate it and harness it, the more powerful you are. We had a gentleman, a plumber, in our home to fix the shower. While it did need one small new piece replaced that was worn over 15 years, the creativity that was required in his approach, I was watching him, not because I was like, prosecuting his behavior or anything. I was just really fascinated. It was about 80% creativity, 20% practical deployment of his skill set. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And I tell my wife sometimes, she'll come into my office. I'm a sales organization at the end of the day. I transact, I book speakers for organizations. There's a lot in my world to it. I like to dial in the content. I like to curate the message. I like to work with the buyer, with the speaker, make sure that we're really delivering that bullseye every time. And there's a lot of shades of gray to it, which are important and which is the messy, wonderful part of it that I love. Sometimes I'm just staring out the window or playing a couple of chords on the guitar, or I have my back to the computer screen and my wife will walk in like, what are you doing? Because I'm not on the phone. I'm not with a calculator. I'm not like writing an email or everything. And I'm like, I feel like I'm in my workshop, even though I'm a salesperson at the end of the day, if you have to reduce it down to a conventional term. And you just speak to that, because I know in your book you touch on that, and in our conversations we've spoken about that.
Well, I love that you're bringing this up and that you started with Kobe Bryant. There's so much there, and just let's start with Kobe and we'll end it with sales.
Right. The ball behind me, by the way, is signed by John Wooden. So just bring it all.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
Yeah.
We have a lot to talk about. So what Kobe did fastidiously every single morning, his reps and practice, that's an example of what I call rigor. And then so that freed him up so that when he was on the court, he said, all I do is solve problems, right? Which is really a creative act, a creative endeavor, so that he could be in this state of flow. Elite athletes elite artists, musicians, elite performers, fill in the blank of whatever it is good that they do, always describe this moment where it seems like time stands still, even though it's happening in split seconds, because they're able to be so intensely focused because they have mastered their craft to be able to do these magic ninja intuitive tricks and solutions. And the way I define creativity is that it's our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems. So that's a great place to start with Kobe's story, because he knew the rules so that he could break them. He knew the rules so that he could extend them and he could rebound off of them as situationally the moment called for. And the best CFOs, CEOs, parents, coaches, teachers do the same thing every single day. And your observation of your plumber is great. I actually interviewed our family plumber at the time when I was preparing to write for the Creativity Leap. And John Harker told me, first of all, he was shocked that I wanted to interview him for a book about creativity. He was like, why me? I was like, what you do seems to me to be so creative. I can't do what you do. And
Right.
he really got into our conversation over time. And he said to me, now he's from Philly, so no offense to Mr. Harker, he hears this, but he said, all I have is my flashlight. I don't know what's behind the wall, right? So all I know is I got to get in there somehow, right? And I don't know what I'm going to see when I get in there, right? So he knows plumbing. He's a master plumber. He has his flashlight and he has his skill and his set of experiences. And there's a catalog of experiences that he can go through and dial through to figure out how to hack the situation. Now, interestingly, I interviewed our family electrician for this upcoming book, Move, Think, Rest. I interviewed Tyler Blades because
You're just going through all the trades.
well, they're brilliant. They
Yeah,
really are
they
essential in
are.
the
I
way
mean, yeah,
they're
they really are.
makers. And Tyler was trying to fix something in our third floor, and I was up there, and I heard someone talking. Who's talking? And I realized Tyler was talking to himself. He was having this conversation with himself, and I heard him say something like, but if I put it over there, that's not going to make sense because then they won't be able to do, he was just having this conversation. So later I followed up with him. I said, Tyler, what were you doing up there? And he said, oh, I do that sometimes. I'm just trying to think through, anticipate what might happen. So I interviewed him for the book, Move, Think, Rest. And it turns out he actually is an expert. He's really into Jungian dream theory and philosophy. So here's our residential electrician who does all this cool stuff about dreams and dream philosophy. Anyway, I say all that to say that the work that all of us does requires us toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. And doing sales is not, the best salespeople know that it's not transactional. It's 1,000% relationship building, right? It's not that movie, was that from the 70s or early 80s? Glenn Ross.
Right, David Mamet. Right, the Glengarry leads.
Yeah, it's not always be closing. That's not what sales is. Some years ago, Daniel Pink wrote and published a great book called To Sell is Human. And he said the new ABCs of selling are about attunement, buoyancy, and connection. I might have gotten one of those words wrong, but that's the gist of it, right? But he was just really honing in on the best. First of all of us are selling, whether you want to admit it or not. We are all selling always. So you can see it in little children. Children are really great salespeople to try to convince you of what they need or want at the time. So all of these categories of jobs that we may kind of initially dismiss as being sort of basic or not requiring creativity, absolutely require creativity, especially if you choose to think of it the way that I do in terms of toggling between wonder and rigor to
Right,
solve problems.
right. And the toggling, the vacillating, because we'll stick with the Kobe example, the rigor, because he was so grounded and had that foundation and the skill set was so mastered, no different than the plumber, the electrician, or the carpenter, these makers, there's also that instinct, that intuition, when to vacillate, when to take the lid off, if you will, metaphorically, and have that open exploratory area, and when you kind of need to stay in the lane, so to speak.
Yeah, and that only is going to happen through making mistakes. And it's
Right,
really unfortunate that we have built these mythologies, these stories that of perfection, and that to avoid mistakes or to hide behind mistakes. And your improv guest probably, I'm sure that was probably a big part of the conversation. It's only, and actually, and one of the improv, first of all, has rules. And one of the rules of improv is that there's no mistakes, there's only the build. You see that in the way jazz musicians work together. So you're supposed to play in a certain key chord progression in a certain key, and maybe the sax player doesn't. That's interesting. How could I build on that? I didn't see
Yeah.
that happening, but this is, oh, we
Yeah.
discovered something new. And so the ability to embrace mistakes, the ability to embrace liminal space, the not knowing, the ambiguity is such an
Hmm.
important
Right.
muscle
Right.
to build, because that ambiguity isn't going anywhere.
Yeah. And being with that ambiguity is an art or it's a muscle. It's there's a lot here. I just back to our viewers, this is such a rich conversation. This is right up our alley. Natalie, you're known as the creativity whisperer to the C-suite, and there's no accident why. And our viewers and listeners and subscribers who are here with us on this episode and those that are going to come and listen to it later know this from this conversation. You've helped top companies unlock this wonder and rigor and how it drives real business, real business. I think, and this is another non-question for you to kind of land the plane for me. I think there's a romance also. What did you say? It was misplaced. Creativity is just for the arts, right? I also think that there's a romance, like the creativity has to surge naturally, or this spontaneous, like divine inspiration or whatever, and while it might not be the sexiest way to go about it, there has to be this didactic matter of fact until it does become second nature and it does kind of operate in the background where, great piano players, they started at 6 or at 7 or at 8. They say the 10,000 hours, Malcolm Gladwell, that's kind of not so
Right.
accurate anymore. But the rigor and that
Yes.
it's second nature, that you're then freed up to explore and go out on the thin branches, if you will, and make mistakes or fall off the limb when it breaks or whatever, because you've swung out so far. If you're talking to leaders in business today about the future of work and the role of creativity and what leaders can do to understand, contextualize, frame it up. No question, help me land the plane. What do you say? What do you say to that?
Well, you started by talking about this romance that we've built out about who gets to be creative, which is really, that's really whack in my perspective, because you're just trying to give yourself or your team a pass to not do the hard, rigorous work that creativity requires. There's a phrase that I created, which is, it's kind of this corollary statement, which is that wonder is found in the midst of rigor, and rigor cannot be sustained without wonder. So what I mean by that, when I say
Mm,
wonder is found in the midst of rigor, for me, rigor is having to file my taxes, which is why I have a tax accountant. Or
right.
rigor is
I just got chills off of that. I don't know if I'm a wonder nerd or something like that. I just got chills off that.
okay, I'm different. Or having to fill out a cumbersome Excel sheet. That's rigor for me. But in the midst of getting into the weeds and the detail and the minutia, how often, whatever your example of rigor is, how often in the midst of the rigor does this aha moment
Yeah.
emerge for you? That's what I mean when I say wonder is found in the midst of rigor. And the corollary to that is that rigor cannot be sustained without wonder. You will burn out if you do not design space and time for the wonder. So both are really essential. This actually is a nice segue. Thank you very much, into the topic of my next book. I have a new book coming out on September 2nd, 2025. It's called Move, Think, Rest: Redefining Productivity and Our Relationship with Time. And my perspective is that the future of work will be one that, first of all, hybrid work will just become work. We won't even look at it as hybrid work.
Right.
Secondly, the most innovative companies will be the ones that figure out how to design a more human centered way of working, where technology amplifies what makes us uniquely human. So in this book, Move, Think, Rest, the basic premise is that we need to redesign work and put old productivity models to rest, because the way we think about productivity is a relic of the first industrial revolution. And that's just not the way work happens anymore. And the reason why we need to redesign work, there's three basic drivers. Number one, unprecedented burnout. People are dying a slow death at work. So something's got to give. Number two, new rules for remote work. Right now, this tends to be a generational divide. The thing is, the younger generations, the millennials and Gen Z, they are the future leaders, and they are digital natives and understand much better than someone like I do about the ways that the technology can actually ease our day
Mhm.
and actually make
Yeah.
us much more productive. And number three, the reason why the future of work is going to require a much more human-centered approach is because of ubiquitous technology. I do not have a dystopian view of AI and robotics. I do not have a utopian view. I have a heterotopian view. I am a pragmatic optimist about it.
Yeah.
If we play our cards right, if we are conscientiously intentional, then we will ensure that we're using the technology to open up opportunities for spaciousness, collaboration, and more imaginative ways to problem solve. There's a section in the first chapter of Move, Think, Rest where I'm essentially saying we've been calling this a tech revolution. It's actually a human revolution. We've been going about this all the wrong way. The reason why it's actually a
Mm.
human revolution and not a technology revolution is because let's say you use ChatGPT to help you jumpstart a couple of a draft of I keep saying going back to marketing strategy examples, but let's say it's a marketing plan. Because you got that answer so much more quickly, now you have time. Now you have time to dream up new ways to approach this marketing strategy. Now you have time to maybe meet up in person with not someone from your team, but someone with a neighbor, with a associate or a friend, to have a conversation that's seemingly unrelated to the work at hand. When you return to the work at hand, that conversation has sparked new sorts of ideas. So the future of work is one where movement, thought, and I don't just mean cognition and rational thought. When I talk about thought, I mean dreaming, I mean
Yeah.
inspiration, reflection. And when I talk about rest, I'm scaling it out to everything from micro breaks throughout the day to sabbaticals. So understanding how to integrate movement, thought, and rest in a much more human-centered way is going to be key to working in a healthy and sustainable way in the future
Yeah.
with technology as our co-creator.
You feel like a full Gen Xer to me. You might be a cusper, but the neither dystopian nor,
I am a
uh,
solid Gen Xer. I'm
yeah.
definitely a Gen
All
Xer.
right. Long live the sandwich
Love
generation. Long live the Xers.
the
Um,
forgotten ones. Yes.
yeah, the forgotten ones. We're smaller in numbers, but we're potent, if you will.
Yes, we are.
We punch above our weight.
You
I
do.
think that's a great way to look at it. It's a human revolution. And it might just require a changing of the guard and changing of the generations that can have it just implicitly a different understanding because they come from a different context and a different history. And there's different innate understandings, as much as
Yeah.
other generations might get it consciously. I think that's a great point to leave it a little bit of a teaser for the September release of your book. And we're just excited to have you here before it comes out and soften the ground a little bit. And obviously when it comes out, we're going to make sure our community, our subscribers and our viewers know about it, because this is why they come here, to meet and understand and learn from guests like
Thank
you.
you.
So just
Appreciate
thank
that.
you for being with us. I love this conversation, and you just strike me as somebody who is just, not only an awesome author and an awesome speaker, but somebody, if I were an electrician, I'd love to come into your home and
Yes.
work on your home and everything else. So thank you. And to our viewers and subscribers, thanks for continuing to come back. We appreciate it. We'll see you next time. And just thanks for joining us on the Keynote Curators Podcast.